welcome everybody to what we really want to open this up and try to make sense of this stuff. So Jamie's just given a brilliant provocation. Can I invite you all immediately? Find someone sitting close to you who looks intelligent and empathetic. If you need to move, just move discreetly to another part of the room. Okay, your job is one of you to the other, explain the blockchain to them. 30 seconds, someone close to you, explain the blockchain.
I'd love to get a recording of all of those discussions.
Yeah, it could be interesting.
That includes you two.
For the blockchain. I think I have one, to be giant electronic adult Lego.
Yeah. Yeah, it's difficult to try to summarise all of that. Like in a big trends, like it's quite it's a difficult thing to do.
Actually, that's how I define a blockchain. I mean, that's what Ethereum is.
How would you describe it? A big, giant electronic...
Adult electronics Lego.
Adult electronic Lego. I always think of that kind of massive public database.
I tend to think of the blockchain.
I didn't even go into smart contracts on it.
Okay, folks. All right, raise your hand. Hello.
So many other solutions out there.
Yes,
Raise your hand if you reckon you've got a pretty good, más o menos, pretty good sense of what the blockchain is. Raise your hand. Oh, that is enormous. Okay. You, ma'am, in the very stylish glasses, up in the front, in the white jacket.
Brutal.
Will you please, come on, give us... Yes, you in the white jacket that's black now. Okay, yes, you, exactly. Yes, go on.
I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Come on.
Distributed database.
Distributed database?
Yes.
Bingo.
And you can't manipulate it from external forces. Whatever occurs on the database, yeah, and that's why it's been so great to do.
You got to hire her, no? Okay. Fantastic. All right. Who here, because I was noticing the mood in the room was sort of, I don't know. Who here thinks the internet is by and large a good thing? Raise your hand. Okay, that's like everybody. Who here thinks the blockchain is going to be a good thing? Who here is a little bit iffy? One on the panel a little bit iffy. Okay, so look, we're just going to try to explore this. What does this thing mean? What does it look like? We're with a panel of people who really know quite a lot of stuff about this, and we want, we'll do a few questions with them. We want to throw it open to the room. Who here is in the financial sector community? Great. Who here is in the anarchist community? We've got 4 or 5. Okay, brilliant. So you notice, by the way, you can't really see this. Actually, can you stand up and show this? We got a fantastic collection of footwear on this panel that I want you to appreciate. Really, it's tremendous, okay? So we want a diversity of viewpoints coming up. But can we start? You've all got the bios things. You've got everything. But Leanne, CEO of Everledger, you are putting this into practice. You are innovating. Give us, get us excited. Why do we need this thing? What is a problem that the blockchain can solve?
So we're Everledger. We started in the Barclays Accelerator March last year, and we took on an ambitious project to help in the reduction of fraudulent-related activities in the diamond industry.
Can you be more specific? What do you mean fraudulent-related activities in the diamond? Make it more juicy for us. Like what?
Sure can.
I know we got people from the diamond industry in the room, so let's make this real.
It was only last month that Alibaba restricted trade for a number of 10,000 carats of diamonds were detected around them being synthetic to be sold as true and genuine diamonds. And that issue came out of the core problem of document tampering. So given that the source of the blockchain is a way to have immutable records, it was a very simple marriage of the technology to solve a problem that's very real, not only affecting financial services, the insurance industry and banking, but also the consumers. Every single one of us in this room that wants to entrust some type of open trading platform needs this sort of technology to enable us to be able to prove certification. And so that's where we started.
Just how does it work? You put the chip in, you put RFID tag in the diamond, how does it work?
No. So we're tracking dumb but expensive stuff. I mean, a diamond is not going to be chip-enabled and connected to the internet. So what we did is we created relationships with the major certificate houses around the globe. And they exist in Antwerp, India, China, and America, where they grade and certify each of the diamonds. So most diamonds are described with 4 C's of the diamond, so the colour, the clarity, the carat weight. And so what we did is we took 4 C's, but we also went a step further. We managed to take 40 data points of that diamond, and we created a thumbprint of that diamond. Not only did we take the 4 C's and the 40 data points, we also mapped the inclusions, so the faults within the stone. And we created that thumbprint and put it into the blockchain as a way to be able to track diamonds that are sold and resold on marketplaces such as Amazon and eBay, and of course more recently now, Alibaba.
Cool.
Yeah, it's kind of cool.
And is it working?
Yeah, well, we haven't solved world peace, but we're getting closer. It's working, yeah, of course. We have 1 million diamonds on the blockchain. We've grown out our tech stack. We have bank-grade securities on our APIs. We work with, no secret, we work with 2 leading insurance companies, Allianz at a global level, and then Aviva in the digital garage in Hoxton Square, and of course Barclays.
Amazing. Okay, if anyone wants to ask, room for a question or 2 from the room, if anyone wants it, please, yeah.
I hear about blockchain used for things like diamond, even fine wine and artwork, which are very expensive things. How quickly is the cost going to come down so we can have everything on the blockchain, which will help the circular economy? So, for example, like just a chair, like a spare chair, I want to pass on to someone else. So, can we bring it down to like $50, $10 items, so we can really keep track of everything?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a proliferation of use cases in supply chain, and more recently there was a startup based in the States that's doing shoes. So they're tracking counterfeit shoes, Nikes. So it's not a $10 chair, but certainly we see the really great handshake on a use cases around counterfeit goods. And of course, that's a $1.7 trillion annually in terms of counterfeit goods on open marketplaces.
Yeah, one of the other interesting areas actually is sort of creative industries, music and anything where people are creating copyright, which then can be very quickly and easily sort of proven as a moment in time as someone owning or creating a piece of copyright, uploading it to the blockchain, adding perhaps a smart contract with that so people can very quickly find it and then use it themselves. One of the most interesting applications at the moment, I think, is in the music industry. And I think the music industry, which is very, very centralized and actually quite sclerotic in terms of how people are paid for when their music's used, i.e. it can take 3 years for a copyright holder to be paid for a play of their song, that can be made unbelievably more efficient and quick with the blockchain. And there's already a number of companies that are trying to do that. And we're talking there about microtransactions. We're talking about fractions of cents per use. So it really can.
If I can follow that point briefly, I think it's not a question of how do we reach scale to bring the scale economies to this. It's already affordable. The question is more around what's your asset and how do you track it and how do you prove provenance of that asset. So with the music industry, there are companies that have done it. What Leanne did is found from her experience in the diamond industry how she could track diamonds. But if you know how to track fresh goods, there's a company in the US that's looking at a very small $2 device that tracks those fresh goods, gives it a unique DNA fingerprint, and hashes that into a blockchain. So things like that, again, it's really around the commoditization of the device, and the IP tends to be around how are you proving this thing is unique. That's the challenge, not so much the cost.
Simon, you're on a roll. So you're with Barclays, you're head of R&D
Yes.
at Barclays. A trusted intermediary.
Mm-hmm.
And blockchain is about eliminating intermediaries
Indeed.
and eliminating trust. Yes? It's about...
I would disagree with that statement.
Oh, would you?
Yes, indeed. It's almost like you set this up.
You would say that because you're from a trusted intermediary. That's going to be made completely, no? I mean, if it's a prime target for
Yeah,
disruption,
for some people,
and yet he's sitting there
exactly,
looking completely relaxed and
The centre
sub-hipster.
Exactly. That's the sort of large organisations that manage transactions between individuals. For some people who are behind the blockchain, they think they're exactly the organisations that should be.
I would agree. I think the assumption of the people who invented Bitcoin was that banks are the problem and the solution is Bitcoin. When you work in a bank, you might not think that, believe it or not. I put it down to, I think pretty much most people in the room would put their hands up if I asked the question, do you like ice cream? But if I asked the question, is your favourite flavour chocolate? Well, then only some hands would go up. And actually, I would say that blockchain is a subject like ice cream. Pretty much everyone's going to like it. But what flavour you like, and there are many flavours.
I love metaphors, but I'm struggling with this one.
Okay, so I'm talking about...
Oh, help us. Is Barclays going to get disrupted? Or how is it not with this technology that we're
So the
looking at
argument
here?
goes that a blockchain by default is decentralized. I believe that a blockchain doesn't have to be decentralized, and or that an intermediary could even play a useful role if it was decentralized. To the point that was made earlier in your speech, what happens when somebody steals your money? Who do you go to? Who kicks people? That is the role of an intermediary, and they've evolved long before banks had IT infrastructure and technology. They were doing that role. Who do you give your Bitcoins to? You can, with Bitcoin today, you stuff your cash under the mattress, and if you lose all of your cash, hey, good luck. And what we've seen is the evolution of intermediaries in the Bitcoin network. So we're seeing that history is repeating itself. It's coming back. There is a role for those people of trust to play that role where you want to park the money or you want to have somebody to kick if something goes wrong.
So you take the remittances market, which I think, according to the World Bank, is $437 billion annually.
Yep.
And it would cost $100 to transfer, so it costs you $11 to transfer $100 to Ghana, let's say, and take 2 weeks. With blockchain, it would be 10 minutes and a couple
But
of
can I
dollars.
explain why it would take that long? Just very briefly. If you think about what a bank does, is it holds a ledger, and another bank holds a ledger. And they do pretty much the same thing, right? I mean, it's just assets and liabilities. Problem is, when you're sending it to Ghana, you're going from this bank to 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 this bank.
Yeah, you've got exactly the type of inefficient system that would be blown away.
And banks would love the inefficiency to go away. The role they play is still useful, though. They're still making sure you are who you say you are and you have that money, and that person is the person that really receives
Do you
the
agree
money.
with this?
I think he's still going.
Yeah.
Do you agree that the banks are still going to play a vital role, that we still need the centre? We still need these institutions that have kept
For the
hundreds of
foreseeable
millions of people
yeah,
without
I mean,
access because the fees
for the
are so big?
Yeah, for the foreseeable future, of course. And everyone can create their own blockchain and everyone can create their own cryptocurrency. And so Barclays could create its own blockchain to manage its own assets and do so in a much smoother way, while at the same time some anarchists are trying to create another blockchain that's going to disrupt Barclays. And everyone in here can create their own cryptocurrency. It only takes a very short amount of time. So it's not as simple as we'll invent a blockchain and then every intermediary is going to be
But you reckon yours will be better and more trusted?
Some will be,
Not
though.
necessarily. If there is one that becomes dominant, that's great for us. Because actually that means that there's a standard for international transactions that we could adopt. Consumers will still want a brand they trust. Large corporates will still want a brand they trust. They'll want to deal with somebody that they know and understand. And when you're dealing with somebody you don't know, the fact that there's a technology that allows you to facilitate the transaction isn't the problem. You want to make sure it's getting to the right person in the right way at the right time. If there's a technology that makes that faster, cheaper, more efficient, the banks are going to be the first to adopt that.
People do have to trust blockchain and Bitcoin. They have to trust how it works. All the cryptographers in the world can say it's mathematically perfect. It's an immutable public record. But if no one believes that, then people
How do I explain that
aren't
to my
going to
mum?
use it.
My mum knows who Barclays are. She knows who all our competitors are. She doesn't know who blockchain is. And I think that's the real problem is it's like describing the internet. If you go back and look at the videos from the information superhighway in 1995, everybody throws out metaphors at you, but eventually it becomes real when somebody wraps it in a brand and calls it Netflix.
I personally totally agree,
Yeah.
and would very much want a trusted brand. Who in the room has got Bitcoin, by the way? Who in the room has done a blockchain transaction? You know, you really feel you're leaping in the dark. You definitely want a trusted brand. Yet there's all this rhetoric that it's the elimination of trust, that the crowd and the peer-to-peer verification is more reliable and more trustable than the central authorities. So you're saying that's just wrong?
I don't know if it's necessarily wrong. I think what's interesting. I think what's interesting about a blockchain is it creates the idea of a glass bank, of glass government. The idea that what you could have is something where, you know, from a bank's perspective, we've had all kinds of headlines where things have gone wrong, but it would be great if what we do is we report things after the fact today. That's what our technology allows us to do. If it's sat out there in sunlight, that would actually be really beneficial for us. It would save us a lot of cost, it would save us a lot of energy. So creating these glass institutions where other parties can verify what's happening inside one institution could be tremendously beneficial and could move the needle forward. Maybe it's not what the anarchists want, but I think it's something that's a giant step forward.
So in terms of our industry, the diamond industry, we've seen a proliferation of synthetics that have come onto the market, and of course in the mid-1950s and 1960s, GE made synthetic diamonds for the purpose of industrial use, industrial saws and blades. But now we're seeing that these synthetic stones are just as gem quality and can be used in luxury goods. So a part of transparency for us is hugely important to preserve the value of the diamond industry that, of course, has been born out of the trusted partner of De Beers. They're one of the biggest global trusted brands in the industry and will remain so forever and a day. But to enable transparency and a non-financial use case of the blockchain is where we see that significant value is added. We're building in glass.
Can I just put it in a slightly different way? I mean, people interested in this don't talk about trust. They talk about trustless systems. They are talking about a mathematically pure system where you don't need to trust anyone, but you can be confident that whatever you are seeing is a true representation of a state of affairs at a given time. I know it sounds weird, but that might be a list of transactions, or that might be information pertaining to certain diamonds or whatever, and you can trust that what is on that database in the order that it is in is accurate. But people could put any old crap on there as well. People could put something onto the blockchain that's a lie, that's a falsehood, and so really we're talking about a sort of abstract system that you can trust in a certain way, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everything on there is an accurate description of a real world event, if that makes some sense.
And think about the world we inhabit today. The alternative to blockchain from where I sit is we empower these wonderful creatures called database administrators. They don't get out much or see a lot of daylight, but they have a lot of power. These people with root access to the back door of databases, and they can change things. And a lot of fraud happens from that. I mean, one happened in the diamond industry. I mean,
So
you
in
know an example.
October last year, the largest certificate house in the world is GIA, the Gemological Institute of America. And in October last year, the GIA was hacked. So 2 people arrested, 20-odd companies were banned from diamond trade. The records at their purest source when the diamonds were originally certified were certified correctly, but those records were tampered with inside of the database. Now, to understand the industry at large, multiple retailers, whether that be in open marketplaces like Amazon and eBay, but even in trusted brands, Blue Nile is a prime example, a really large NASDAQ-listed company, often have virtual stock, so virtual stock holding based on certifications. So, of course, when there is a breach inside of a siloed system, particularly when the trusted node certifies over 65% of the world's diamonds, has been affected, that prolificates across the globe and into the hands of consumers.
So to add to that, imagine a world where instead of having one administrator, what if many administrators were possible? What happened with Bitcoin is we made everybody in the world an administrator. I would argue for a lot of use cases that's overkill. But it's really useful to have many administrators. You reduce the risk of something being dishonest if you have many administrators. Think about where something strange has happened. A piano has fallen from the sky. If everybody in the room saw it, then you'd be pretty certain it's happened. But actually, that's very expensive computationally and comes with a lot of drawbacks. Bitcoin itself has a lot of reputation for having a lot of drawbacks technically. But what if you only had, today you have one person comes out of the room and says, a piano fell from the sky, and you go, yeah, of course it did. If you have 5 people come out and say it, or 10 or 20, then it carries more significance. And again, it's harder for them to get away with dishonesty. And I think for me, I see a sliding scale of kind of, you've got Bitcoin on one side of this real extreme, and then you've got centralized databases here. And actually all of the points on this continuum are very, very interesting. And this is where I get really excited, is what are those alternatives looking like to solve problems today?
And yet I get a sense that for you and for everyone on this panel, the blockchain is not just a sort of incremental new piece of technology that increases the efficiency of the existing financial system, even though it will do that for sure.
I would agree.
So what's the stuff that is, and obviously Everledger we've heard from, but what's the other stuff? And then I'd love to hear from you in just a second. But what is, and maybe to rebut some of this, but what's the stuff with your accelerator, for example, that really should excite all of us in this room?
So, the answer to that is probably not the answer you expect, because the ones I can see, and this was, again, a point that was made earlier, is the academic that was working on the internet did not expect Netflix. Looking at this today, the stuff that excites me is the stuff I haven't heard of yet. The stuff that the incumbents aren't doing is the stuff that's really exciting, that will come from the edges and will serve new markets. The stuff that we can use it for, I understand very well. So smart contracts is fantastic. Instead of walking into a branch and having to take 2 pieces of paper, what if you could just simply do that digitally on your phone in real time, and it pulled the money directly from your bank account? What if instead of 2 large banks signing a derivatives contract between each other, and then filing away a piece of paper and then not knowing what the price was when the market moved, they actually all signed that on a shared ledger on a blockchain, instead of signing that piece of paper and putting it in a filing cabinet? They would have a shared state of that agreement. There is a thing that happens today where in all kinds of industries, we agree a contract between each other, and then we scan the last page of the PDF with signatures and send it to each other. And then there are disagreements because people don't know what was written in the core contracts, and people have different versions of them. That must cost the economy an incredible amount of money every year. To have a shared state of a contract is phenomenal. I mean, that's a giant leap from where we are today. When you build onto that, now you can do if this, then do that. If the price moves, then change this. If the price moves, then do that. That, I think, is going to be an explosion of interesting ideas.
Can we throw this open, with your permission, Sarah? Can we throw this open to the room a bit? Do people think the blockchain is evolution or revolution? Raise your hands if you think it is just too early to tell, first of all. Raise your hands if you're firmly convinced there is something that is going to be revolutionary for existing structures. Raise your hands if you reckon it will be used for efficiency purposes and real power structures. The people who call the shots will remain pretty much the same. Okay, there was probably too many questions to come up with a clear conclusion. But I'm surprised how you, Jamie, aren't painting a more revolutionary picture. And you seem to think that it's going to be the existing institutions that are going to, for the time being, stay pretty much as they are. So I want to hold that. I'll just park that. Is there anyone in the room who's got a question they would like to ask? Please. Sorry, can you shout that out again? Can you hear in the back? Can you explain just how you are so confident it's not going to be manipulated, the Byzantine generals, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, it's the Byzantine general problem. So I tried to describe it with the piano hits the floor. So that's one example where many people witness something. And the second thing is, are you familiar with the search for a prime number? So the idea is that it's divisible only by itself and 1. The thing with the search for a prime number is the larger the number, the harder it becomes to find. So the problem that the administrators in Bitcoin have is, how do they solve that problem? Well, it's really, really hard to find a new prime number, but it's very, very easy to prove it is in fact a prime number. So if somebody's done the work, I can prove you've done the work. I can proof of work what you've done. So I can mark your homework with almost no computation. But doing the work is very, 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 very hard indeed. So if I'm going to go to all that expense of doing that really hard work, there's got to be some benefit in it for me. There's got to be some reward system. So what Bitcoin said is, I'm going to give you these 25 magic beans. Well, they're called Bitcoins, but they could have had any name. And I'm going to give you these 25, and it so happens that they have a market value. So what happens is you're economically incentivized to maintain the truth. Now, there may be other incentive structures, that's just the Bitcoin structure. So what you now have is everybody in this room would get an economic reward for being the first to solve this puzzle. And then you'd stick your hand up, and then everybody could immediately mark that you'd actually solved that puzzle. But you wouldn't solve that puzzle unless there was a big reward for it. So it creates this structure whereby you can only add records if you've done the hard work. And that maths puzzle is really, really critical to it. It keeps integrity. Does that make sense? I'm seeing some confused faces here.
It's a really difficult thing.
It is a hard
The more
concept.
you try
That's
to,
the best answer I've found so far.
The other way I like to think of it is, so you have a certain number of transactions that people have done amongst themselves, and then once one of the people have sort of done that mathematical puzzle that you've heard and verifies that all of those transactions represented what it thought other people would have within the group of people. So we're all sending money to each other, and it's checking that, yes, I do have 10 Bitcoins in my wallet. I've sent you one. Now I only have 11. Sorry, I only have 9, and you have one extra. That wouldn't work. And so on. And then after 10 minutes or so of transactions, someone does this puzzle. It verifies that all of those transactions were correct. It then makes essentially a sort of photo, it's another analogy, but like a photograph of those transactions. Then new transactions that take place have to follow on from the ones before it. You can't suddenly start adding new weird, I suddenly say I've got 15 Bitcoin when the network says I've only got 10. You can't do that. The database will reject that as being not in line with what it expects. It cannot be back manipulated, because each time that 10 minutes worth of transactions are then stored, it goes into it's why it's called a blockchain, into a chain of blocks of transactions etched in stone that everyone then has a record of, and that you can't change the history of.
We've got a professor of computer engineering on the panel, and she has not spoken yet, so I would love to invite
I think I'll do a worse job, to be honest.
Sarah, can we please ask you, and if you, so we'll get to your question in just a second if we can, but feel free to address this impossible question, but also just, as a deep expert on the science of this, is this hype? Are we at peak blockchain already? Is this going to slowly subside? Is this just a fad? Is there something real happening here? What's your take on it?
So I definitely think there's something very real happening. That being said, I am probably the naysayer on the panel. I do think the blockchain is ultimately a bit overhyped, right? So to the question about, putting the chairs on the blockchain, putting every instance of streaming a song on the blockchain, putting every financial transaction across the globe on a blockchain. If you did that currently, you'd basically melt the planet. The system just can't tolerate that kind of scale. So the Bitcoin network currently is hashing at a rate of 400 million gigabytes per second, basically a lot, generating a lot of electricity, and yet it's only able to process 5 transactions per second, 5. Okay, so most of you work at, I imagine, quite big companies. That number is laughably small at this point. Okay, and if you switch over to Ethereum or other kind of systems, you're going to encounter the same limitations. So I'd really argue that the blockchain is overkill. And sort of going back to this, spectrum that Simon referred to, I'd really like to sort of point people towards more modest technological solutions than the blockchain. And I think for a lot of applications, these are entirely sufficient and don't run up against these limits that these systems, I think, really inherently face. And to try to just answer the question, one more angle. Basically, the way I think of it in terms of this immutability is that you'd not only have to subvert a lot of assumptions about trust, and trustlessness, right? So basically, so many different people would have to collude to try to lie to you about the history of the blockchain that becomes really implausible. And then sort of what we've been getting at with these puzzles is that you'd also have to subvert cryptographic standards that have been proved or not proved, but sort of proved over time to be extremely mathematically difficult to do. So you'd sort of have to subvert human trust relationships and cryptographic guarantees.
But you need 51%, yeah?
No, you don't need anywhere near 51%. So there's been a lot of work showing that probably 25% is sufficient. And also currently in Bitcoin, there is definitely a coalition of miners who definitely have 51% anyway.
And they're all Chinese.
And they're all Chinese, and they don't pay for electricity. It's amazing.
So you're saying it is co-optable?
Oh, very much so. So yeah, I think back to sort of the point Jamie made in his talk, you know, blockchains do very much have the potential to avoid censorship, but the state that we're in today, in 2016, is that I think censorship is almost certainly happening. I'd be really, really shocked if transaction censorship weren't an issue right now.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that this coalition of miners could block transactions from entering the blockchain if they wanted to.
So it's not the utopia that people thought it might be, but I still think it's valuable. And I want to counterpoint some of those. Lian's using a flavor of blockchain that doesn't run at 5 transactions per second, but near 100,000, is it?
Yeah.
So, and I think what that does is it gives you something that's different to what Bitcoin gives you. So again, the reason this sounds complex is because it is, but I would point you to that spectrum. It is, right? But I would point you to that spectrum. Who are you and what do you want to achieve? Do you want more assurance than you have today, or do you want all of the assurance in the world? There was a great stat that said that to break the Bitcoin network in pure mathematical terms, you'd have to calculate all the grains of sand in the universe to the power of all the grains of sand in the universe to the power of all the grains of sand in the universe a few times over before you could ever break some of the numbers that are being done by the computers behind Bitcoin. So, I mean, that's a huge number.
Sure. So what we like to use in cryptography is you'd basically, with modern computers, be waiting until the heat death of the sun
Yes.
To break the system.
Questions, please, yes.
For Sarah, then, do you not think that there's a future for IoT and blockchain?
Sure. So I think there's a future for all of this, you know, for every point along the spectrum. I think it's just a matter of finding the right point for the setting you're talking about, right? So if you're, say, at a bank and, you know, you're talking about solving a problem like real-time gross settlement, okay, like where the only other people you're going to be communicating with are other banks, and you know in advance who these entities are, then I don't think, you know, a fully decentralized solution or a fully transparent solution or a fully pseudo-anonymous solution is right for you, right?
I agree with all of that.
Sure, and so then my argument is that something like, say, Ethereum, which again, I think absolutely has its use cases, but I would argue that that's not one of them, and I'd urge you to, you know, find someone who knows distributed systems and come up with a significantly more modest solution.
Please.
Just saying hypothetically, I was the world's most radical anarchist. And I was looking at blockchain. What systems were I looking to break blockchain to make it radical?
What systems, hypothetically, would you be trying to break as an anarchist? Yes?
I think the attempt of Bitcoin was to break the central bank and government hold over money. I think that's about as big as it gets, really, isn't it? It's true.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'll point sort of to another project, which is security on the internet.
Oh, BitNation as well is an interesting one. So BitNation is entire democratic governance. So an entire system of government based entirely on blockchain. It's an interesting idea, the idea that we would self-organize. And take a look at the BitNation project. It's actually got some really sort of grounded, short-term, tangible goals, but its vision is really quite far out.
Well, I'm following BitNation for my next book, Radicals, and spending a lot of time with the people that are doing it. So, the more modest ambition is notary services. So you can just verification of documentation, which actually is probably quite a good use for a lot of governments to use as well. Identification services. So, BitNation actually offered. For the UN to work with the UN to provide identities for refugees that you could then place on a blockchain and verify. But yeah, more long term, what they're hoping to be able to do is that each and every one of us could essentially create our own laws based through smart contracts that we would agree with each other, and every single transaction between us would take place on the blockchain. And so you would essentially be able to have sort of self-governing autonomous nations that are completely digitally sort of digitally existing. I mean, it's a pretty, I'd say, pretty long-term, a pretty long-term plan.
So maybe in the shorter term, actually, there is some talk of using the blockchain to essentially try to take down technological monopolies, right? So companies like Uber and Airbnb, I mean, they have this sort of sharing economy future, but the idea is that all of the power is still very much centralized in the hands of these tech companies. And so, you know, there's a lot of ideas out there for doing, you know, decentralized ride sharing, decentralized sharing economies, essentially. And I think that could be done on certainly a much shorter timescale.
Just back on BitNation, one of the services they're also offering is smart contract marriages, where you can program the length of your marriage. Apparently the ideal length is 5 years. That's what I was, they send renewable with mutual consent. I'm just mentioning that.
Yeah, and if it doesn't work, the assets are automatically, through a smart contract, redistributed to the two parties. Imagine the amount of money you could save on...
What's not to love? We got a question here. And hold on. This gentleman was grandfathered from, and then we'll get, please.
There's a couple of points I just wanted to ask you on. One is, when we talk about blockchain, there's two kind of key areas. There's digital currency and there's distributed ledgers. And they're two things that are separate. It's just that Bitcoin uses one to do the other. In terms of the digital currency, I think there's a lot of challenges around that. Technically speaking, split forks, and I wondered how, you know, what your view on split forks in the blockchain as you start to get more people using it, whether it's Bitcoin's blockchain or any other blockchain, as you start to get lots of people using it, you're going to potentially fork off on the blockchain as calculations done at the same time.
Yeah. So your question's about the forking, and could this be a problem?
Yes.
So the question is, what happens if the Bitcoin, if the blockchain starts to fork?
It's already
as they start to fork.
Classic and Core is in the middle of a war at the moment, which is why everybody's jumping to ETH. And you know, hot tip, it's a great hedge against Bitcoin prices. The interesting thing is, about 2 weeks ago, I sat in a meeting of G20 central banks looking at exactly this subject, and I would agree with their assessment, which is there is no fit-for-purpose architecture for digital currencies for central banks yet, although there are some amazing pieces coming out of the Turing Institute and UCL, and there are some fantastic pieces of computer science work that look very, very promising. I would not say Bitcoin would be it yet, and actually the way in which it's designed as a blockchain, you know, depending on what your definition of blockchain is, if your definition of blockchain is purely decentralized, then it does risk forking, and it probably needs a major overhaul before it could be ready for any sort of central banking use case. And then I totally agree with your point. I was one of the co-authors of the UK Government Office for Science report, and it actually talks about distributed ledgers beyond the blockchain, because when you talk about shared databases, that's what we're really talking about. And shared databases with multiple administrators doesn't sound that revolutionary, but actually it's phenomenal. Multi-administrator databases could solve a whole bunch of problems for all parts of the economy. It might not be a blockchain, but it's huge.
Question here.
Yes, this is for Jamie, actually.
Jamie.
Could this kind of eliminate the idea of passports, and could it be pivotal in migration and different ways to track people if we're kind of tracking and governing ourselves?
Can you hear that at the back? Could this be pivotal for passports, for digital ID, for refugee tracking, etc.?
Yes.
I think identity services are going to be one potentially very valuable use for this. And it's one of the uses that, in spite of what BitNation hopes to do, is something that nation states will take and use. And if they see that it's a more efficient and more effective way of managing identification services, then yes, I think that's really quite possible. But the timescale, I mean, including the sustainability issues that you mentioned in terms of how expensive this actually is and how actually environmentally damaging it can be, it is worth thinking about the sort of time that this might take to come about. I mean, it was sort of a decade before, it was a decade from the first internet connection between two computers, ARPANET connection between two computers, and emails being sent. And that wasn't ever really intended to be the use for it, but that's how long it took. And so that's the sort of timescale I think that we're talking about. But certainly that is, I certainly see that as one of the most important areas.
Sarah.
Yes, so just one other issue that I think we haven't touched on that really comes up in this question of identity on the blockchain is, as we've been describing blockchains, we're talking about them as globally visible, completely and utterly transparent. And so there is obviously a lot of data, like passport information, that you just don't want to be globally visible. And so actually from a technological standpoint, this is a huge problem that we're working to tackle. How to balance the sort of transparency that you want in terms of, say, issuance and stuff like that, with the privacy that you clearly need to protect personal information.
Absolutely. So MIT has a concept called self-sovereign identity and a project called Open Mustard Seed, which I think really moved this concept forward quite significantly. And they talked about the early days of using Docker containers for your identity. Now it's more about IPFS containers. So actually the data itself would act like Snapchat, but not on a centralized server. It could only exist as an ephemeral blob that then disappears. But then your blockchain really comes into its own when it acts as a notary. It's a notary for diamonds. It's a notary for houses. It's a notary. You sent this person this data and it was destroyed. That really puts the identity in your hands. And there's an organization called ID2020.org. They're working with the UN around Goal 16.1, which is providing identities to at-risk children. That goal is they're actively looking at some of these technologies, and it's maybe it's a blockchain, maybe it's a notary of a distributed ledger or a shared database. There's a terminology question there, but I think it's very interesting. We could move to self-sovereign identity with a combination of IPFS and a blockchain as a sort of notary.
Very interesting. We have a question here, then a question here. Please.
So we talked about the environmental and energy limitations with the blockchain, and I was just wondering if all the applications that are being studied are taking into account this limitation, and especially based on, for example, the scenarios on greenhouse gases emissions.
Okay.
So that's only if you use the Bitcoin blockchain, one extreme. You have all of these other flavors that you can go at where you don't have anywhere near the green. It's like running a server. It's running a laptop. You can run this thing on a smartphone. You've really got options here. So if we were to assume that everything must use Bitcoin, then you have those problems. But I'm of the view that very few things ever will. Bitcoin will sit and it will serve a purpose, but it's ARPANET, it's not the internet. It will get co-opted and moved in many different directions, and it will be part of an ecosystem of databases. It's just the first, it's not the last.
Our technology stack uses both the Bitcoin blockchain and we have a private distributed ledger, so we use the best of breed.
So you're not suggesting to the room to go and buy Bitcoin now?
I couldn't make investment advice anyway.
That's why I said
for
you're
who I
not.
work for. I'm not allowed to advise. So.
Yeah, go on though. Come on. But your instinct is that there's going to be a fracturing, a fragmentation of the.
My view is that there's going to be more blockchains or distributed ledgers in future rather than less, and we will call that the blockchain. It will kind of become, there was the Bitcoin one, and there'll be many others. But actually, the cover of The Economist was about the concept of the blockchain, and we're actually calling the blockchain things that are a lot more than this Bitcoin database. It's this whole suite of ideas. It's become a term that means almost nothing, like big data or something. It's become this huge thing that's actually a whole set of concepts.
Please. Thank you.
Thank you. I was just wondering what happens when a product changes. So if you have one rough diamond that then becomes 3 polished diamonds, how does it work? For example.
Good example. So our technology stack, firstly, needs to still embrace external technologies. And in the diamond industry, we've seen a series of technologies that exist to enable scanning of those diamonds. And someone raised IoT before as a marriage between blockchain and IoT. And I think that that's a really great use case. The enablement to be able to do a hard handshake between the transaction layer inside of a ledger and this external technology, and to effectively prove that machine handshake, I think is a very interesting and probably a more perfect use case than trying to deal with dumb but expensive objects, for example, art or diamonds or wine. There is definitely a parentage that needs to be respected, and I think as we start to think about identity and these other sorts of use cases, we really need to start to understand how would we have a linkage in terms of those transactions. But certainly with inside of the blockchain, we already have a chain of records that enables those records to know what's come before it and what's come after it. So at the very source of the technology itself, it does have the ability to bring that parentage through in terms of transactional data. And as we start to think about how that could be challenged in terms of rough cut diamonds as an example, where you have one large stone that effectively gets cut into little children, we're facing the same challenges in terms of identity and parentage. So the industry in the diamond industry certainly hasn't been able to solve the rough cut diamonds in terms of parentage with any larger surety, which is why the focus of our Million Diamonds has been in the certified space. And that challenge, we're looking forward to working with industry leads that of course have been in the industry since the 1800s to work with us in being able to help solve that with this emerging technology.
Jamie, can I bring you back in here?
Yeah.
So this hard handshake, I love this phrase, of the Internet of Things and the blockchain.
Yeah.
You talked about the end of censorship, Jamie.
Yep.
Isn't it the beginning of self-censorship that we're headed to? If everything is recorded immutably on this immutably and pseudonymously on this publicly accessible database, aren't we entering into some sort of Foucauldian nightmare, some sort of panopticon, a bit like Dave Eggers' The Circle, where everything is known and everything is monitored?
Well, you might say we're already in that space. I think we do. I think we have a big problem with self-censorship already. I think that we already live in a world in which people are very afraid of saying what they think online because of the fact that their data is all collected and stored and it's reused. It can be used against them. I know lots of particularly young people who are actually very afraid of putting their opinions online for fear that it will come back and haunt them in a decade or 20 years or so on.
Yep.
So, in a sense, we're already going in that direction. I think that I should have probably said the end of centralized censorship, or where centralized censorship becomes far more difficult. And there are very good reasons for doing that. There are very positive reasons for doing that. There are incredibly worrying implications of doing that as well. So to me, I see we're kind of going in that direction already. Censorship is already far more difficult. My book about the dark net was also about how difficult censoring information is on essentially almost impossible to censor part of the internet called Tor hidden services that makes information, you can delete it for a while, but because it's sort of a distributed system where lots of people have encrypted hard drives with stuff, they just re-upload it again. And I think there's huge problems with that, huge problems. I mean, falsehoods and lies and all the rest of it, once they're put onto a blockchain, they're also very difficult or impossible to remove. Now, if that results in people self-censoring more, which it probably will, yes, it's not the end of censorship at all. It's just a different type of censorship. But personally, I think that's where we're going already.
Does that make you nervous?
It makes me very nervous. But I think we'll get used to it. I think that we'll
That's okay then.
Whether it's okay or not is almost besides the point, because I think it's happening.
Because we're passive, and what we should do is lie down and wait for the technology to come and land on us like the chocolate piano.
Welcome our new technological overlords.
You welcome?
Our technological overlords. It was a joke.
Okay.
One of the things that is,
this is a big thing you just said. You just said, hold on, our job is to sit here and wait for the technology to arrive.
Well, you said that.
I didn't say that. That's what you said. You said whether we like it or not, it doesn't matter. It's immaterial.
It's coming. I said it's happening. I said it's already happening.
Right, so you're just saying accept, be passive, be consumers of the future.
I didn't say be passive at all.
You did.
No, I didn't.
We could go on like this
We
for
already
hours.
have, yeah. I mean, one of the great problems, seeing this from a political perspective, which is more my work, one of the great problems at the moment, I think, is that the sort of de facto public space, the speakers' corners of today, are Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. They are where most of the big issues of the day are thrashed out. We come to think that that is a public space that's owned by all of us and to which we all have a right. Well, we don't. That data is owned by somebody else. The server space is owned by companies based in California. They can kind of do whatever they want. They can make arbitrary decisions about what they'll choose to censor and what they won't. That is quite a worrying thing for any kind of political system. And the blockchain is potentially one alternative to that, that's not controlled by centralized companies on the other parts.
But everything is going to be recorded.
But the problem is, well, yes,
If
it
you
is.
go with the Bitcoin blockchain. There are, I know, I don't want to labour the point, but there are many other designs here.
Yeah.
And I think that was the point I tried to make in the Government for Science report. There are many designs here, and actually we need to look at those different designs so that we don't have this binary choice between everything ever is recorded for everyone for all time, which seems dystopian, and the world we have now, which is becoming increasingly difficult to manage and more centralized. We've seen throughout history this tension between people, the original people behind a lot of the internet movement were anarchists and were pulling in one direction, and then we have people that make it safe for consumers and pull it back to the middle, and this tension will continue, and out of that we'll probably forge something that doesn't look a lot like Bitcoin, but actually doesn't look like today's system. It would probably be somewhere between the two, and that's kind of where we spend a lot of our time focusing.
What does it look like, this good blockchain? Does it exist? You're saying these models, where is it? Where can we buy it? Where is it?
So, well, I'll highlight an example. I do not work for Google by any means, but they are currently running a project called Certificate Transparency. So the idea is that certificates are issued on the internet, and if you don't know what certificates are, they're basically the reason that that green padlock shows up in your bar when you try to go to a secure website. And the fact is that, like all central entities, there is no reason to trust these services. The services that issue these certificates, they get hacked constantly. They don't do due diligence. So, I could go to them and say, hey, I'm such and such website, and they'd say, great, here's your certificate, when in fact I have no relationship to this thing. And so this project is actually aiming to make this whole system more transparent, so that basically bad events in the system can get caught earlier. And this distributed ledger, whatever you want to call it, is very much one of these solutions that I think you're referring to. It looks nothing like the blockchain. I've talked with the people working on this. They think the blockchain is insane. So if you're using the word blockchain to describe what they're doing, then fine, that this is a good blockchain.
Yes.
But the fact is that this is a solution that I think is very much in the middle, and it's still distributed. It's not Google telling you, oh, the certificate issuance went well. It's anyone running a server who's telling you that. And so I think that's hopefully where I'd like to drive things more in that.
And that's where the technologists are going, is towards that more Paxos model, right? That model is emerging, but I would say nobody's dominated it yet and said, this is it. And that's what I'd throw open to the crowd, is build it and come sell it to me. I'd love to buy it, but it doesn't exist. There are people with bits of the puzzle, but it feels like the jigsaw puzzle's not complete yet, which is why it's so exciting at the moment.
What's your take? You've been very quietly. From Everledger, do you just welcome all of this? Bring it on.
What was very interesting for me last year is I did spend some time at Google. I was invited as a part of 10 female entrepreneurs. But what was more exciting was to spend some time inside of Google X. And Google X, of course, brings some of the largest, is endeavoring to solve some of the largest problems in the world. And they've brought the autonomous car to market, and of course they're working on the Balloons project. Substantially for me, I didn't really set out. I kind of thought that the blockchain and Bitcoin was really interesting. And I've come from 25 years of emerging technology and spent most of that time playing with kind of cool stuff, right? RFID in the mid-90s and, WAP before it kind of died. And so when this technology came, first and forefront for me, I sort of thought, wow, this could actually go and solve some of the problems that I can see emerging in my industry, in something that I love and adore. And how do we apply this? But when I spent some time inside of Google, I just want to make a kind of a statement. It really occurred upon me that when the guys at Google, Larry and Sergey, decided to go and create this amazing algorithm to really, enable some sort of index of the world's information, it didn't occur to them at that point in time the burden of their invention and the seriousness of what it was that they truly did. And I spent 2 parts of my day with them, and the first part was truly understanding at a technology layer, and the CERTS project was one of them, and what this meant in terms of scale and what have you. And the second part of my day was, as a startup, and as an inventor and as somebody that is applying a technology in an industry that is super important, not only from an emotional standpoint, but even from a financial standpoint, what is now my responsibility? What is our industry's responsibility to ensure that this technology is being used in the right way? And the most impressive startups that I've met, whether that be through the Barclays Accelerator or even globally across many other countries, are actually now at the deepest part of their soul, staying awake very late at night, being sure that they can try and answer that problem or answer that question, because this technology is truly transformative. It is a tectonic plate shift in the way that, firstly, we do commerce. And we know that this level of transparency and these tools we probably haven't seen in generations before us. And so these questions, I lay awake now at night less about the fact that we have to scale out the blockchain or scale out this technology. I lay awake thinking, who should we have a collaborative set of conversations with, and should it be governments and should it be leaders in industry to ensure that this technology is placed in the right hands with the right people?
Please.
Hello. I'm just thinking about how the technology could be applied into more sort of grassroots community settings and perhaps individuals. So I'm not technological at all, and I'm just thinking about how the change happened where individuals could start to set up their own websites and their own blog pages through WordPress and set up your own online shop through Big Cartel. So can you see it happening, and how quickly might it happen where small charities or larger charities or not-for-profit organisations may be able to access this kind of technology to help with their endeavours? So, for example, if you've got a community woodland and you're producing seed from the trees that then you're planting into saplings, and you would want to assure the provenance and be able to trace the life of that tree, or you're taking wood fuel from and you're selling that on, and you want to be able to trace, to prove the sustainability of that source. So talking about it in terms of big supply chains where companies may be able to put together these big databases, but in terms of the sort of software that applies, that's accessible to grassroots organisations for things like blogs and websites. Do you see that sort of developing for this kind of technology?
Sort of the democratised...
The tools that you can use to pick up yourself. I would say the tools are still very nascent, but there is a great community. There are a few drag and drops out there, but they kind of look like the early days of geosites, if anybody remembers geosites. It's the first internet pages where I've done my first internet page, and it was horrible text and horrible background colours and bright flashing blinking. We're in that phase. You can do it, but it's hideous. You probably want to find somebody in a community who is a developer who can pick up the tools that are there, that are quite expert. And people who are good at software will pick it up relatively quickly, but you have to be a pretty good developer at this point. I think we're at least 3 years away from those tools where you can do it. You can truly DIY with no development knowledge. But what you can do is you can find those developers in your community who are already developing on this stuff over there, and they're doing websites or they're doing something else, and you can point them at this sort of software and say, help me figure this out and work in my community. I'd also point you to an organisation called Backfeed, backfeed.cc. They build a community of interesting projects along these lines and really help connect people who are doing these things around the world. So there are other people solving some of those challenges. Whilst I don't know of them, people like BitNation and Backfeed.cc are trying to build you those tools, but I don't know that I've seen that tool is ready to place in my mum's hands, for instance.
Well, I think there is a danger that we have a sort of system where you have people who understand blockchain and people who don't, and it's kind of another inequality, another sort of digital inequality in society, and certainly that worries me, although that's some way down the line. I think that it's a case of trying to work out why it might be useful for any one particular thing. Like, what is a challenge that might be being faced, and then perhaps working with people that will give up their time and software skills to help you to try and find where it might where it might be useful. What's the challenge that this might be able to help with?
Okay,
But-
picking up on that immediately
Yes.
after you finish, please.
Well, I was going to say, but there's still so many things in terms of general big data or digital skills that third sector organisations are so far behind on that we should try and help them catch up with those things first, rather than worry about the middle
I
time.
would agree. This is really going to the cutting edge of quantum physics, where really you just need the basic GCSE level kind of science at this point. Just get the basics right was a very fair point.
All right, I want to throw out a challenge. So, Jamie was, the role of technology. Do we accept it? Do we shape it? I want to do a sort of citizens jury on this with you four. Take either side of the debate that you want. The question is, does society need the blockchain? Okay, and the room is going to vote on whether we would want to tilt, with our brains, our capital, our whatever, would we want to tilt towards more blockchain or less? Unmanaged, let it out, or manage it, keep the reins on, okay? So the room is going to vote. It's going to be a little mini technology assessment committee, and we're going to give each of them a minute to make their case, let it rip, or keep the reins, keep the lid on it. Yes? Everyone agree? You agree? Okay. Starting with Leanne.
Okay. I think there is an imperative that this technology should be used. And certainly ethical trade is at the very core of what Everledger wants to help achieve and solve. And so 80 countries came together and they created the Kimberley process. And for me, it's a Boy Scout promise. And they did well. The diamond industry was truly a guiding light in terms of the reduction of blood diamonds. It reduced it by over 22 and 23%. Yet it has, the Diamond Office here in the UK is armed with a fax machine and an embossing stamp. There's replicated systems, there's siloed databases, yet there is an absolute promise at the very heart of our industry, stemming from De Beers at its very core, right the way through to 80 countries. We want to solve blood diamonds. We do not want to see child labour. We do not want to see people shot and maimed. This technology enables the tools to solve the last mile problem. And once we can do that, we can then start thinking about how the diamond industry can be shown as a guiding light to solve other issues. Ivory, out of Africa, and it's banned in China for 1 year. Why? That's not good enough. The British government led its charge on the British Slavery Act in October last year around ethical trade, and it's an incumbent upon large organisations, not just the jewellery industry and the diamond industry, but even Apple on mobile phones. And if this technology can be used as a very core to helping ethical trade, then that's where this technology should be. So absolutely, it's a global ledger. Giddy up, I say.
Thank you.
And world peace, we want that too.
Thank you. Please, Sarah.
Yeah, I guess I basically agree. This is just something we need. We've seen over the past, few years, decades, that central systems with opaque mechanisms just don't work. So the trust that we as a society have in these mechanisms has really just been significantly eroding. Especially coming from the US, people have just stopped trusting the government, okay? And instead, they're somehow turning this trust towards entities that I would argue deserve it far less in a lot of ways, right? They're turning their trust to Facebook and Instagram and Google, and this is also not where it belongs, right? So I think opening up these systems, showing people how they operate, letting people audit their mechanisms so that they can see for themselves that this is doing what it's meant to be doing is really crucial. And I should mention, even if you don't want to do it, even if you don't want to go poke around inside of these things, someone does, someone might. And so I think these things should exist, regardless of your own level of interest. I mean, I also work in privacy, and we've been having the same debate there for years, right? Even if you don't care so much about keeping your own data private, privacy is a right, and having technological solutions that enable that right to be exercised is, I think, really crucial for us as a society.
If we don't engage with the subject at all, it stays on the fringes, and that's where it's most dangerous. If we keep it on the fringes, if we ignore it, it stays illegal. It's neither illegal nor legal. And actually, as kind of productive members of society, we owe it to ourselves and to our grandchildren to really engage with this and try and steer it the right way. And I think there's a real opportunity to do that, especially if you look at the spectrum of technologies there and the types of problems that can be solved. I believe that it's incumbent upon every large institution, especially an institution that has a lot of trust like a government or a bank, to figure out how this can solve the problems they have today and will have tomorrow, and really bring that transparency. Software developers have a term called dog fooding, eating your own dog food. I think if we can dog food transparency, then we'll get to a point where the technology really makes sense for people. So my impassioned plea is engage with it, learn with it, play with it, and get involved. There is no downside to learning more.
And finally.
Well, I think society needs pretty much as many interesting, innovative efforts at solving problems as possible, because I think in the years ahead we face collectively an incredibly turbulent future, whether that is enormous expansion of internet-enabled devices, privacy problems, nation-states collapsing and desperately needing to rebuild infrastructure quickly and cheaply, problems with internet security. It's really difficult years ahead. And so anything actually that can help us try to grapple with these problems, think about these problems, come up with solutions to these problems, even if we can't imagine quite what they are yet, are desperately needed. But if anyone thinks that any technology resolves the problems of the world easily, i.e. it makes society more equal, it creates world peace. It's the end. In the 90s, all the digital visionaries were saying that this amazing technology, the internet, would bring people together. It would be the end of racism and nationalism. And you can read, we're talking about, heads of MIT saying it was the end of nationalism because people wouldn't care about that anymore. It's absolutely ludicrous. And so there is definitely a danger that in any of this technology, we solve some problems and we exacerbate other problems. And I think that's exactly what this is going to do. But frankly, with the way that we're going, I think we need to try. Things are really difficult, so I think we desperately need, it's worth, how do we say, sort of taking a punt, rolling the dice, because we need different ways of solving the problems we're going to face.
Okay, folks, so we're now going to put it to the vote. Option 1 is keep a pretty close lid on this one. Raise your hand. Oh. Option 2 is roll the dice, let it rip. Fantastic. And on that note, will you please join me in thanking this fantastic panel?